Digital transformation is more important than ever now that we're in the fourth industrial revolution, where the lines between physical, digital, and biological worlds are becoming ever more blurred. But fully 70% of digital transformations fail. Today, my guest, Tony Saldanha, and I discuss why digital transformations fail, the 5 stages of a digital transformation, how culture has an impact on digital transformation, how leaders can avoid biases in their organization's transformation, amongst other topics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast, episode 102, Why Digital Transformations Fail, with Tony Saldanha. Welcome one, welcome all to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. It's your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy, and welcome back. It's great to have you here. You're here because we're here for one reason and one reason only, and that is to make you a better leader. And that's by focusing on our 3 dimensions of leadership here at Moving Forward Leadership, and that is improving you as a leader yourself, improving your team, and improving your organization. And today we are focusing on the 3rd aspect of leadership here at Moving Forward Leadership, and that is improving your organization by discussing why digital transformations fail. Today, my guest, Tony, is a globally awarded industry thought leader. He's led operations around the world and major digital changes at Procter Gamble. He wasn't discovered due to any innovation or technical problems, but the devil's in the details, right? It was a lack of clear goals and disciplined process in order to achieve them. So in his book, Tony lays out a 5-stage process about how we can go from digitally automating processes to making digital technology the very backbone of our companies and organizations. So we have a great conversation here. We talk about digital transformations and why they're so important and how you can, basically ensure your organization gets through them successfully and don't become a part of that 70% that fail at them, right? So, hey, folks, that is it. Why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation all about why digital transformations fail and how you can avoid being a failure with Tony Saldanha. Tony, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. It's great to have you here finally.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
So today, we're talking about why digital transformations fail, but I think more importantly, how to properly do a digital transformation. And here at Moving Forward Leadership, I focus on 3 main areas of leadership: leading yourself, the leader, leading your team, and leading your organization. And this definitely goes into the latter, I would say, of leading your organization and ensuring that it transitions properly.
That is correct.
So you've written this incredible book, which I'm glad to have a copy of. Thank you very much. And it's all about why digital transformations fail. So let's dive into, first off, the inspiration behind the book. Why did you even write it in the first place?
So I've always liked to write. When I was in school, in college, I wrote for the college magazine, stuff like that. And so I always had this itch that I'd love to write a book. And for a long time, I actually went back and forth between writing a fiction and a nonfiction book until, I talked to another friend of mine who's a published business author. And he said, forget about the fiction stuff. Why don't you start with writing what you know about, which is business. And so I decided to give it a shot. And it's been a great journey. I mean, I've made a ton of mistakes. It's my first book. But I have to say there's nothing quite as fulfilling as, having gone through the process and having something to show for it. I mean, it's a little bit like, cooking your own creation. It's great.
No, well done to you. Everything is definitely a learning experience, a learning journey. Yeah. This podcast is definitely a good example of that. I've made many mistakes along the way too, but here I am today, and I like to say I have the best podcast on leadership going. So, but that's very biased, obviously. Anyway, so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. So the first part of your book, you discuss why digital transformations fail in the first place. So why don't we start there before we start diving into the real goods of it?
Yes, absolutely. So the short answer, the counterintuitive insight that I had was that digital transformations fail, and they fail at a horrendous rate of 70%. Right? They fail not because of technology, not because of time, and not because of money, but they fail because of one simple thing: discipline. Discipline, specifically in being excruciatingly clear as a leader about the goals that you set on digital transformation, and the discipline in actually the execution methodology of how organizations go about doing this. Right? And I mean, we can get into a little more detail of that, obviously, but this was the big learning for me. Very counterintuitive. The short answer is discipline.
Yeah, definitely would like to go a little bit deeper because I often talk about discipline in many different regards, but mostly on the personal side. So this is more interesting because it's on the organizational side. I often say, especially with goal setting, when I'm talking about goals and for personal goal setting, is discipline is what's going to take you forward. It's not motivation. Motivation is only good for a temporary period of time, but it's discipline that actually gets you there over the long period of time. So how does that look on the organizational side, why they actually fail going through the digital transformation?
Yes. So, and both of these are, more aimed at discipline for us as the leader. Let me start with the first area of discipline, which is discipline and goal setting. This is where I actually give us as leaders a little bit of a pass, because I think digital transformation is such a hyped up word. In the process of actually doing some of this work while I was still at Procter Gamble about 4 years ago, I met with about 100 different leaders, startups, big company, consultancy, so on and so forth. And among other things, I asked them one question, what does digital transformation mean to you? And I got, as you can imagine, 100 different answers, right? And I think that's one issue, which is digital transformation is a little confusing. I mean, because, somebody said to me the other day, we had digital watches in the 1970s, right? We've had digital technology and digital cell phones, for so long. So what's new about digital transformation? And the fact of the matter is that, defining exactly what that is, and then defining in the context, as I do in the book, of the fourth industrial revolution. So, you may be very successful in the third industrial revolution era running your business. Now, how do you completely rewire your organization and your products to be successful in the fourth? Is what I call digital transformation. And most leaders obviously struggle a little bit to define it. So that's one issue of discipline. Right? The other issue of discipline is essentially, as I was saying, in execution. So not surprisingly, given the confusion on the terminology of digital transformation, when most people think in terms of execution of digital transformation, they either think innovation or they think project management. And in reality, neither of those is sufficient for digital transformation. For digital transformation, which is a dramatic change, you need something that's closer towards organizational change management, plus venture capitalist-like approaches to high risk, high return type of efforts. And so I've defined an entirely new approach, execution approach for this.
That's super interesting stuff, and let's dive into that approach now, shall we? Because I think that's really where we want to spend the bulk of our time together, is talking about that approach. Your five stages of a true digital transformation. So let's go into them, shall we? Absolutely.
So here's the issue on the discipline, right? It's a little bit like what I call Alice in Wonderland. I mean, I'm sure you and your listeners all remember, this incident in Alice in Wonderland where, she asks the Cheshire Cat, which way should I go? And the Cheshire Cat says, well, it depends, what's your goal? Where do you want to go to? And Alice says, well, I don't really care. And then the Cheshire Cat says, well, in that particular case, it doesn't matter which way you go, right? And I know that sounds too glib, but you know, in a lot of the work that I do, I did at Procter and Gamble for about 3 decades, and now I do with the Fortune 100 C-suite and boards. Um, inadvertently, this is a little bit of what plays out, which is if you're not very clear about what success looks like, how do you decide, right? And that's really the point you were making around the approach and the methodology. So here's what I've done to bring a little bit of sanity into the hyped up topic of digital transformation. I've basically come out with a 5-stage spectrum on, let's get extremely clear on what we're talking about. So stage 1 is actually pure and simple automation, right? So this is, when you have the software salesperson who comes into you and says, hey, I'm going to give you digital transformation. I have a new email communication systems, right? I mean, in reality, that's what they're talking about. Not real digital transformation that's going to change your company. But, quite honestly, just automation, right? And the other end of the spectrum is stage 5. That's a Netflix or that's an Amazon, where not just technology, but a culture of agile digital thinking becomes the backbone of your entire company. And that's what allows Netflix to reinvent itself at least 3 times, from mail and DVDs to streaming media to original content to now international relevance, right? And you do that not because of technology alone, but you do that because the culture of the organization becomes self-disruptive, right? In between are 3 other stages. So if stage 1 was basically simple automation, stage 2 is siloed transformation, where either one geography or one department says, hey, I'm going to dramatically change, not just 10 or 20% change, but 10 times type of change the way I run my business, right? And then you go to stage 3, where the company says, no, we've got to have a corporate digital strategy and a plan. This is what GE, Jeff Immelt, did, several years ago when he said, I want to be a data company, right? And then stage 4 is basically when you finish that. As we all know, famously, GE didn't quite get to that digital transformation. So stage 4 is when you complete the technical change in the company, but obviously you're still missing the cultural transformation, which is what you get at stage 5. So this 5-stage model really helps bring, hopefully, a little more clarity. So leaders are extremely clear about, what stage they are at, where do they want to go to in which year, and then, of course, then you come to the execution, which is a separate issue.
You were hinting at something along the whole lines, the 5 whole stages, and you've hinted at culture there a number of times. Why is culture so important? And I guess on top of that is, how can culture actually be a hindrance to digital transformation or help it move along?
Yeah. So, so culture is, quite honestly, the ultimate disruptor, Scott. I like to tell people, and this is true based on my own experience of, as I said, driving some pretty big transformations inside of Procter and Gamble, that real transformation is actually 10% technology and 90% organizational change. So here's what happens in most companies, right, or organizations. You come out with the next big disruptive idea, your next flashy product, right? And then you do a pilot and it's successful. This is going to be, the next biggest thing since sliced bread. Then you take it back into your operational business units, and they crap all over it. It's like, oh, this is never going to work. This is something that we've tried before. The market doesn't exist, so on and so forth, right? And that entire process is called the innovation value of death. Now, the innovation value of death is nothing else but a culture issue. So here's what we do as leaders in most organizations. We basically tell our people, we want you to essentially be extremely predictable and reliable in giving us great performance, right? So that's basically our reward systems for middle managers, right? And then the first time we go and throw something that's completely disruptive, that is mind blowing, the normal reaction is, "Oh, wait a minute, this is never going to work," right? And I think that's essentially what happens. That's how culture inhibits constant innovation. Now, on the other side, on the positive side, you have companies such as, for example, the Virgin Group, right? So Richard Branson's companies, um, where so Richard Branson is a great proponent of entrepreneurship. He's constantly challenging his people to come out with new ideas and to scale them, right? And therefore, not a surprise, but over the last 30, 40 years, he's basically started up like 600 companies, and of course spun off or killed many of them. But that's what the Virgin Group is, and that's how they become a constant reinventor.
Those are some great insights for sure for the audience out there. And yeah, culture is definitely a huge proponent of whether or not transformations succeed or fail. You're a leader. You're busy. You're busy taking care of your people. You're busy taking care of your organization. And if you're a small business owner and you're at the top of the food chain, you're here listening to this podcast because you want to know how to lead your people better. So you don't have time for that nitty-gritty details that revolve around marketing. Believe me, I get it. I'm with you side by side. So that's why, I've tapped into using Penji. If you look around at all my social media, banners and logos, they're all developed by Penji. Jonathan Grzybowski, co-founder of Penji, has been a great supporter of the podcast, and I'm supporting him. So if you go to penji.co, penji.co, and use the coupon code MFL15, you're going to get 15% off your monthly subscription. And that isn't just 1 month. No, that is for life. As long as you're paying into them, you're going to get that 15% off, which is huge. Check it out and see if Penji is right for you. Because you know what? I know they're right for me. Again, that is Penji, penji.co, and use the coupon code MFL15. And now, time to get back to the show. You talked about a bit earlier about execution, and I always feel like whenever we have a transformation coming down the pipe, or any change regardless, execution, it seems like we just jump straight to execution without going through the previous steps as required. And, the change in culture, properly putting out the new digital technology, whatever it is. How important is execution there in this strategy that you have?
Oh, it's everything. It's absolutely everything. We used to have a CEO of P&G who used to say, execution is the only strategy that the consumer sees or the customer sees. So, if you don't execute, obviously nothing goes to market. And that is so true of digital transformation. So here's the issue, or here's the bottleneck around execution, right? When we're talking about digital transformation, especially stage 5 digital transformation, we're not talking about a 5 or 10% change in the performance of the business, right? We're basically talking about the business reinventing itself, right? So, going back to my Netflix example, killing off its business on mail-in DVDs in order to take a bet on streaming media. That is pretty bold change, right? So that's not, your few percent change. So execution that's required for that kind of change is closer to the venture capitalist approach of, high risk, high return type portfolio management, rather than your, fixed income. Let me put this into your safe investments or predictable stocks and bonds, and that's a totally different approach, right? And so what happens on execution is that in most organizations, digital transformation is called just another project, right? And we know the reward systems in most organizations is once you have an idea, once you have a project, you better make that project successful. Nobody wants to be associated with a failed project, right? And that's a different approach to what happens, for instance, at Google X or in most venture capital organizations. Google X, this is the driverless car, balloon internet type, group within Alphabet. They consider themselves to be a project killing machine. They they go through thousands of potential project ideas, and eventually they run only about 20 or 30 of them at any given point in time. And any week, they might actually kill a project because the team that's working on the project says, hey, I don't think we're going to meet success criteria, right? And if you kind of think about project management methodology, that's not what you get taught, right? To have, 1,000 ideas and to keep killing until you end up with, a few dozen. And that's the execution that's necessary for high risk, high return type of ideas, which is essentially what digital transformation is.
That's a very interesting thing, right? Basically, put a load of ideas out there and constantly just say, okay, this one's not going to work. Scratch it off. Let's keep going, and you basically boil it right down to whatever has the most highest chance of probability of success.
Yes, yeah. I one of the things that I learned from Google X, which absolutely amazed me, was when they do decide to take up one of these few dozen projects, other than the project manager, the first person that they put on the team is a finance manager, right? And that went completely against everything that, is an image in my mind, which is, oh, I thought this is all about innovation, right? And we know, um, especially upstream innovation has this reputation of, oh, just get stuff done. Don't worry about the money or, about the schedule, stuff like that, right? Whereas this goes back to my theme on discipline. What I learned was that, no, that's not true. The most successful disruptive organizations are disciplined about watching the money. They're disciplined about, again, high risk, high return portfolio, right? Just like you are in your personal investing. And that's the key to success.
Now, we're talking about discipline, and we're talking about having a lot of projects, a lot of ideas out there. And I think one of the hardest things for leaders to do is not get biased. They have this pet project. They're like, oh, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. Our market share is going to go through the roof, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as you go through the process, some people are starting to go, I'm not too sure, boss, if this is actually going to take off for that reason. How can leaders keep their head clear of these biases and getting attached to certain projects as they're going through their digital transformations within their organizations?
So two things. One is that they have to follow a very, very rigorous methodology to manage these transformations, right? At Procter Gamble, when I ran this 10x disruptive organization called Next Generation Services, we put together a methodology that was a combination of three things. It used design thinking to completely reimagine what's possible. And then the second part was it basically used lean startup to iteratively work through the ideas. And then at the tail end, if there was some development to be done, that's when we used, Agile and Scrum and other kind of methodologies, right? So the first thing is to make sure that you have a methodology, right? Because that's going to keep you disciplined. And then the second thing is to be extremely deliberate upfront about defining financial stage gate criteria for every gate, right? And sticking to it. So one of the things we used to do was to basically say, hey, really don't care, who thinks this is a big idea. But if my finance person, even before I take on the idea, doesn't say this idea is at least we had a threshold of several tens of millions of dollars ROI, then I don't even touch it, right? And then at the first stage, it was, 4 weeks, and I need to see, these 5 questions answered. And if they're not, that's fine. It gets killed. We move on to the next. So it's really, really important to kind of think of yourself more as a venture capitalist person who's funding different startups and just being dispassionate about, which one goes through and which doesn't, as opposed to, like a visionary like Steve Jobs saying, I'm going to make this successful no matter what. I think that's a totally different model of innovation.
You talked about different methodologies out there. So Scrum is one, Agile is another one that I've talked about on the podcast a few times. Obviously, just your standard project management ideologies, et cetera, et cetera. I would venture to say not one size does not fit all, right? So how can leaders go about making sure they're actually, one, picking, and two, implementing the right strategy for their transformation?
That's a really good question, Scott. I think what leaders really need to do is to assemble the right methodology and the right tool. And the way I did that was essentially by, almost like drawing a big board of, different types of work, different stage gate approaches, and then different methodologies, right? And it was quite literally a really big, 3 foot by 2 foot, kind of printout on the wall that talked about these methodologies. So, for example, you want to distinguish between day-to-day operations, right? Continuous improvement work and 10x disruptive innovation. And each of those needs a very different approach, including a very different project management methodology, right? And then even in 10x disruptive work, as I was talking earlier, we basically kind of created a hybrid methodology that, pieced together things like design thinking for ideation, lean enterprise, lean startup for, the middle iteration. And then, if you had the right kind of disruptive development, that's when you would get into iterative, agile and Scrum and other kind of things, right? So you're right. Agile isn't the right model for every IT project. You have to be extremely clear about when it works and when it does not.
Yeah, for sure. And I've never been a fan of picking one ideology, one methodology, and sticking to it right through every single scenario. So I definitely appreciate that response. One of the things that I like focusing on is pitfalls, where people get hung up, where they fail, but more importantly, where can leaders, how can leaders ensure that they don't fail? So as we go through the digital transformations, as leaders guide their organizations through them, what are some of the common pitfalls that organizations have? And then most importantly, what can leaders do to ensure it doesn't happen to them out there?
So in the book, I actually list out 10 what I call surprising disciplines, and if you flip that over, it's a discipline is essentially a potential pitfall that you're trying to avoid, and what I try and do in the book is for each of these, I provide a checklist of at least about 5 questions that you can ask. To avoid falling into that trap. But let me give you some examples. And we've actually already talked about several of those. We've talked about choosing the right iterative methodology for execution, right? And that's a pitfall. Some of the biggest failures in projects, including innovation projects, have been because of the use of the inappropriate project management methodology. In the book, I talk about, in the U.S., the Obamacare website rollout and what went wrong, right? And uh, that's a good example of I think the wrong methodology used until they actually went back and brought in a SWAT team, and then they did a fantastic job and exceeded expectations as a result of that. So a lot of kudos for actually getting the job done, but there was missteps there. So anyway, so back to your question on pitfalls. Let me start at the very top when it comes to sponsorship, right? When you're driving through digital transformation, you're not driving a itty bitty, little automation project. And this is something that's going to have complete skin in the game and sponsorship from the top of the organization, right? And then in the book, I basically give a list, a checklist of, if you're a project manager who's been put on this, how do you make sure that you've got everything that you need in there, right? Another great example is of a pitfall is change management approach. So, for example, if you're driving a really, really big transformation, you have to understand. You almost have to kind of have a matrix that says, how big is the change that I'm trying to drive? So how disruptive is it? And map that against the change appetite in the organization, right? Is the culture of the organization change resistant, or is the culture, change accepting, right? And then depending on that, you could go all the way from saying, oh, we'll put together an internal team to do that, all the way through, just like Walmart did with their acquisition of Jet.com. I'm not going to bother with this. I'm just going to acquire the capability, right? So that's another potential pitfall. There's several other pitfalls, including getting focused on technology rather than organization change. We've talked about the culture, right? There are pitfalls related to then not being extremely clear about what the outcome of the transformation is, right? And therefore giving clear direction to the team. So, like I said, there's about 10 of these, and that's one of the reasons why 70% digital transformations fail. I mean, it can get pretty hairy, it can get pretty complicated, and of course, this is a big stakes game.
No, for sure. It's definitely no easy task, right? Transformation, taking an organization for point A and putting it towards point B, which is in a slightly different, or if not very different direction that what you've been moving in the past, is no easy task whatsoever. And someone who's been in there and doing similar work like you have and trying to get transformation done, it's a tough slog. It's a long slog. It's hard. It takes a lot of time. Like you said, like you've pointed at, discipline and just work and communication. So, Tony, thank you for coming out and talking to the audience, talking to the people out here. Before we wrap up, I just got a couple last questions.
Sure.
And the first one is, according to you, Tony, what makes a great leader?
I think a great leader is basically somebody who is extremely clear about where they want to go and is completely not afraid to roll up their sleeves and lead rather than manage, right? And, of all of the leadership heroes that I've had, on the public, private side, a whole bunch of stuff, they've all had that characteristic. They've been hands-on, they've been there for their people, and they're extremely clear about what they're going to do.
That's an awesome answer. I couldn't agree with you anymore. Final thing is, how can people follow you? Where can they get the book? Feel free to give yourself a shameless plug. It's all about you right now.
Well, thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. So the book is called Why Digital Transformations Fail. And it's available on Amazon and, everywhere where books are sold. Online, the website is www.procter www.whydigitaltransformationsfail.com. Or also my personal company website has more information. And the website is transformant.io. So that's the word transform and the insect ant kind of mushed together. .I India O Oscar.
Awesome. For the audience out there, it's easy as always. Just go to movingforwardleadership.com/102, and all the links are there in the show notes for you. Again, Tony, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you just got back from a whirlwind traveling session of about 6 months. So kudos to you. Enjoy your well-deserved break. And for the audience, as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Really appreciate it.
All right, that's all I got for you fine folks today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the interview. And most importantly, I hope you got something out of it. And if you did, remember, R squared, S squared, right? Rate and review the show so that it gets a little bit noticed, a bit more. But most importantly, I can help more people because that's what I'm here for. That's what my guests are here for, is to help more people become better leaders and not being bosses, right? So remember that. R squared, rate and review. S, share the show. Share this show with someone who you think can relate to the podcast as a whole and today's topic. And then finally, subscribe. Subscribe so that you never miss another episode. And you can do that via your podcast playing app of choice through movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, stop bossing and start leading. Take care now.